Æthelbald, remembered by history as King Æthelbald of Wessex, the second son of a dynasty clinging to survival in an age of fire and salt water. He was born into a kingdom already at war, not by choice, but by fate. His father was a king, his grandfather had been a conqueror, and from the moment he could understand such things, Æthelbald understood what it meant to be an Ætheling, a prince with a claim, a man who must be ready, always, to rule, or to be ruled over. He grew in a court where the smell of smoke from Viking raids was never far from the horizon, where the throne was not guaranteed to any son, where loyalty was earned in battle and lost in a single bad season. He proved himself on the battlefield. He stood beside his father and helped deliver what men called the greatest slaughter of the Danes that anyone had ever witnessed. He earned his place. And then, when his father left on pilgrimage and handed him the keys to Wessex, everything changed. His father came home with a crowned queen, a teenage Carolingian princess whose children would outrank him. And Æthelbald made a decision that would define his life, shock the church, and haunt his name for 12 centuries. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have only just found us, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable. Lower the lights. Let the day slowly slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm and complete story of King Æthelbald of Wessex, a young Anglo-Saxon king who ruled in the shadow of Vikings, rebelled against his own father, married his own stepmother, and left behind one of the most debated reputations of the early medieval world. We will move gently through his world, from the violent, uncertain days of 9th century England, to the battlefield where he first proved himself, to the conspiracy that shook Wessex to its roots, and finally to the quiet, unrecorded years of a reign that ended far too soon. All of it told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Æthelbald's story surprised you most, help keep these tales coming. To understand Æthelbald, truly understand him, rather than simply judge him, you must first understand the world that made him. And that world was one of almost unimaginable tension. It was a world of mud and thatch and candlelight, of great stone churches rising from the earth like prayers given weight and permanence, of a people who had carved kingdoms out of the forested, river-laced landscape of southern Britain, and who were now watching, generation by generation, as something new and terrifying pressed in from the sea. The 9th century in England was the Viking century. It is tempting, from where we stand now, to see those raiding fleets as a kind of historical backdrop. The noise behind the more refined story of kings and courts and Christian learning. But for the men and women who lived through it, the Norse ships on the horizon were not backdrop. They were the whole story. They were the thing that shaped every decision, every alliance, every marriage negotiation, every question of succession. Who would rule when the king died? It mattered enormously, because the wrong answer, a weak king, a divided court, a disputed throne, could mean the death of everything. The Norse came, at first, in small numbers. The earliest raids recorded in the English sources date to the very end of the 8th century. A small fleet, an isolated monastery, a community of monks who had no walls and no soldiers, and nothing standing between them and the men who had crossed the grey northern sea. Lindisfarne, in 793, was the monastery that history chose to remember as the symbol of the beginning. It sat on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, one of the holiest places in the English Christian world, home to the relics of St. Cuthbert and the memory of Aidan, and a tradition of scholarship and prayer that stretched back over a century. When the Norse ships landed and the raiders swept through its cloisters and its scriptorium, the shock that ran through the English church was not simply grief at the loss of a building and its treasures. It was the shock of a world order being challenged in a way that nobody had expected. But Lindisfarne was only a beginning. In the decades that followed, the raids multiplied and grew. The Norse were not a unified people with a unified agenda. They came from different parts of Scandinavia, under different leaders, with different ambitions. Some wanted silver and slaves, and were content to take what they found and leave. Others were beginning to think about land, about settling, about winter quarters, about England not as a place to raid, but as a place to live. The shape of the threat was evolving, season by season, and the kingdoms of England were struggling to evolve with it. The political landscape of England in the early 9th century was one of multiple competing kingdoms, the so-called heptarchy, though the number of significant kingdoms varied over time, and the system was never as neat as that label implies. Northumbria controlled the north. Mercia dominated the Midlands and had, for generations, exercised a kind of loose overlordship over the southern kingdoms. East Anglia held its own, and in the south, the kingdoms of Kent, Essex, Sussex and Surrey orbited in Mercia's shadow, while Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, occupied the great arc of southern and southwestern England. Wessex was not the most powerful of these kingdoms at the beginning of the 9th century. That distinction belonged to Mercia, whose kings had been the dominant force in southern England for the better part of 200 years, exacting tribute and demanding submission from their neighbours with the casual authority of a power that had grown so accustomed to dominance that it barely had to think about it anymore. But Wessex was tenacious, and it had something Mercia lacked, a run of capable rulers who understood both war and statecraft, and who were, in the 9th century, about to have their moment. Æthelbald's grandfather was Ecgberht, a man whose story could fill an entire night on its own. He had come to the Wessex throne in 802 after a period of exile in the court of the Franks, driven out of England by Mercian pressure on an earlier king who had found Ecgberht's ambitions threatening. The years in Francia had not been wasted. He had seen how a great court organized itself, how military power could be projected, how the machinery of Christian kingship worked at its most sophisticated. When he came back to Wessex and took the throne, he brought with him an ambition and a competence that would reshape the political map of England. In 825, at the Battle of Aclea, fought somewhere in what is now Wiltshire, the exact location uncertain as so many of these 9th century battlefields are, Ecgberht broke Mercian power. The Mercian king was defeated decisively, and the gravitational field of southern English politics shifted. The kingdoms that had orbited Mercia for generations, Kent, Sussex, Surrey, Essex, began one by one to shift toward Wessex instead. Envoys arrived from the Mercians' former clients, offering submission and alliance. Even Northumbria, far to the north, sent men south to acknowledge Ecgberht's supremacy. For a brief season, the chroniclers used a title that they rarely bestowed on any English king, Bretwalda, ruler of Britain. Ecgberht's supremacy did not last in its fullest form. It never did for any early medieval king, whose authority was always dependent on military reputation and personal presence, and who could not simply leave behind institutions strong enough to enforce obedience after his death. But what he did achieve, in a more durable sense, was the establishment of a West Saxon dynasty with a genuine, recognized claim to primacy among the English kingdoms. He also achieved something rarer still in early medieval kingship. He passed his throne to his son without a civil war or a disputed succession. When Ecgberht died in 839, his son Æthelwulf became king of Wessex. And for the first time in 2 centuries, a Wessex king had followed his own father directly onto the throne. This was not a small thing. The instability of early medieval succession, the fact that kings so often died to find their thrones contested by cousins, brothers, rival families, was one of the structural weaknesses that made every kingdom vulnerable. Every disputed succession was an invitation to outsiders, and the 9th century had no shortage of outsiders ready to accept such invitations. That the House of Wessex was now establishing a genuine tradition of father-to-son inheritance, that the principle was beginning to bed into the political culture of the kingdom, was one of the foundations on which everything that came later, including Alfred's survival and legacy, would be built. Æthelwulf was a complicated man, as so many capable medieval kings were complicated. He was deeply pious, perhaps more genuinely at home in a church than on a campaign. And this piety was not merely performative. He gave generously to the church, he prayed. He thought about his soul and the souls of his people with the seriousness that his chroniclers record, without any hint of irony. He was also, beneath the piety, a ruler who understood what the Viking age demanded. He had spent years as a sub-king of Kent before inheriting Wessex, learning the trade of governance in a subordinate but responsible role, and the lessons he had learned were not soft ones. He suffered defeats against the Norse. The scale of the raiding was growing, the fleets were getting larger, and no English king of this period managed to simply hold the line without reversal. In 836, Ecgberht himself had been defeated by a Viking force at Carhampton in Somerset, and Æthelwulf faced similar pressures in the early years of his reign. But he was capable of fighting back, capable of winning, and capable of understanding that the defense of England against the Norse was not simply a military problem, but a political one, requiring alliances, requiring the cooperation of neighbouring kingdoms, requiring the kind of sustained, organised response that no single ruler could provide alone. Into this court, into this family, into this kingdom perpetually braced against the next blow from the sea, Æthelbald was born. His precise birth year has not survived in any reliable source. The great royal genealogies and the monastic chronicles that preserve so much of what we know about this period were not, as a general matter, in the habit of recording the birth dates of princes before they became kings, dates of deaths, dates of battles, dates of episcopal appointments and royal councils. These the scribes noted carefully. The birthday of a young prince, one of several sons, in the 830s. This was not the kind of event that commanded a line in the annals, so we are left with approximation, probably sometime in the 830s, most likely in the earlier half of that decade, born to a father who was at that point a sub-king managing the Kentish territories under his father Ecgberht's broader authority. His mother's identity is almost certain, but not absolutely confirmed by the sources. She was almost certainly a woman named Osburh, a noblewoman of West Saxon stock who was said to be of the lineage of the old Jutish kings of the Isle of Wight, and who is described in the sources with genuine respect as a woman of intelligence and learning. Asser, in his biography of Alfred, records a famous story about Osburh and Alfred's childhood, a tale about a book of poetry and a mother who promised it to whichever of her sons could learn to read it first, and a small boy who took the book to his teacher and came back having learned it, and received it as his prize. The story is charming and probably embellished, but it carries within it a picture of Ecgberht as a woman who valued learning, who made it a living thing in her household, who wanted her children to know that the written word mattered. Whether Ecgberht was also the mother of the older sons, Æthelstan, Æthelbald, Æthelbert, and Æthelred, has been a matter of scholarly discussion. The age gap between the eldest known son, Æthelstan, and the youngest, Alfred, is quite large. Æthelstan was old enough to be appointed as a sub-king in 839, while Alfred was not born until 849. Some historians have suggested that it is more likely that the older sons were born to an earlier, unrecorded wife, and that Ecgberht was Alfred's mother, but perhaps not Æthelbald's. The question cannot be resolved with the evidence currently available. For the purposes of tonight's story, what matters is that Æthelbald grew up in the royal household of Wessex as the second son of the king, with all that implied. His name, Æthelbald, rendered in the Old English of his day as Æthelbald, was a name that carried meaning. It was composed of two elements, Ethel, meaning noble, and bald, meaning bold, noble and bold. It was the kind of name you gave a prince with expectations, a name that announced something about what a father hoped his son would become. And in the rough, demanding world of 9th century kingship, where noble birth was the entry requirement and boldness was the test, it was a name that either fit or didn't, and its owner would spend his life demonstrating which. The world in which he grew up was one defined above almost everything else by the Church. Christianity had been the religion of the English kingdoms for 2 centuries, brought first to the north by the Irish mission from Iona, and to the south by the Roman mission of Augustine, who had landed in Kent in 597 at the request of Pope Gregory, and begun the systematic Christianization of the English peoples. By the 9th century, the Church was not merely a religious institution. It was the fabric of literate culture, the keeper of records, the trainer of administrators, the builder of the most permanent structures in any English landscape. The great cathedrals and monasteries were the most substantial buildings most people would ever see. The bishop was often the most powerful figure in a region after the king, and sometimes more powerful than the king, in practice, if not in theory. For a royal prince growing up in this world, the church was everywhere. Masses were said every day. The liturgical calendar structured the year. The rituals of baptism, of confirmation, of marriage, of burial, all were church rituals. All carried meaning that was simultaneously religious and social and political. A king who was generous to the church built credit in heaven and, more practically, built the loyalty of the bishops and abbots whose cooperation he needed to govern. A king who fell out with the church, or who did something the church found unacceptable, risked the one form of sanction that no medieval ruler could entirely ignore: the threat of being cut off from the sacraments, excommunicated, declared by the church to be outside the community of Christians. Æthelbald would, in the course of his life, come close to that line. He would do things that at least one churchman considered unforgivable. And the fact that he did those things anyway, and that no excommunication actually came, tells us something important about the limits of ecclesiastical power and the particular circumstances of mid-9th century Wessex. But that is a part of the story we will reach in time. For now, let us remain with the young prince, growing up in the court of his father, learning the trade that would eventually be his. The earliest documentary record in which his name appears comes from 840, when he appears as a witness to one of his father's charters. He is listed there as Filius Regis, the king's son, a designation that placed him in the formal machinery of royal governance even as a young boy or young teenager, present at the court, learning how power was exercised and documented. Through the 840s, he continued to witness his father's charters in this role, a recurring name in the lists of witnesses that tell us who was present at the moments when the king's will was made permanent and legal. These charters, the formal records of land grants, of privileges conferred, of rights confirmed, are among the most important surviving documents of Anglo-Saxon England. They are not romantic documents. They are dry, precise, formulaic. They record the transfer of estates, the granting of exemptions from various obligations, the confirmation of boundaries. But the witness lists that accompany them are windows into the world of the court. They show us who was present, who had status, whose name carried enough weight to serve as testimony. For a prince to appear regularly in those lists was to be visible, to be recognized, to be acknowledged as a person of account in the political world of the kingdom. And gradually, through those years, Æthelbald's status in the witness list grew. He moved from simply Filius Regis, the king's son, one among potentially several, towards something more specific. In 850, the sources record that he received the rank of Ealdorman, the Old English title that the charters render in their Latin as dux. It was a meaningful elevation. An Ealdorman in the Anglo-Saxon world was not simply a nobleman by birth. He was a man with real regional authority, a man who could lead levies of fighting men in the field, who administered justice in the king's name in a particular region, who collected certain revenues and held certain responsibilities that went beyond the passive dignity of aristocratic blood. For Æthelbald to receive this rank, probably in his late teens or early 20s, was a signal from his father that he was being prepared for something, that he was not merely a decorative royal son, but a working member of the kingdom's governance. And the world outside the court was very much in the habit of reminding such young men what working membership in a 9th century kingdom actually demanded. In the year 851, the coast of England shook beneath the arrival of a Viking fleet, unlike anything the chroniclers had previously recorded. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that remarkable, sometimes frustrating, always irreplaceable document of early English history, states the number plainly and with the quiet authority of someone recording something they still cannot quite believe. 350 ships. 350 ships working their way into the mouth of the Thames, a dark and ordered armada carrying thousands of fighting men who had already demonstrated, in the decades of raiding behind them, that they were capable of penetrating deep into the heart of any kingdom they chose to target. Let us pause with that number for a moment, because it is easy to read it and move on without fully grasping what it meant. 350 ships. Each ship carried somewhere between 20 and 40 warriors. The exact number depended on the vessel's size and the nature of the voyage, but these were fighting men, experienced fighters, men who had crossed the North Sea and who had chosen this target. At the lower estimate, that fleet carried 7,000 men. At the higher, it carried 14,000. The population of an English town in the 9th century might be a few hundred people. The entire fighting force a West Saxon king could muster at short notice. The third, the levy of men who owed military service, might, in a good season, number in the thousands. This fleet, arriving in the Thames, represented a military force that dwarfed anything that any single English kingdom could reliably put into the field, they did not disappoint their own terrible reputation. The army that disembarked from those ships stormed Canterbury, one of the great ecclesiastical centres of England, a city whose cathedral housed the archbishop and whose streets were lined with the accumulated wealth and craft of centuries of Christian civilization. Canterbury fell. The city was sacked. The treasuries of its churches were emptied. The people who could not flee suffered what people always suffered when a Viking raiding force moved through an undefended settlement. The violence, the loss, the particular grief of watching something that had taken generations to build reduced in hours to ash and scattered rubble. Then the army turned toward London, and London too fell to them. The ancient city, the great trading centre on the Thames, the place where merchants from across the known world brought their goods and where the wealth of England flowed in and out. London was taken and plundered. Beowulf, king of Mercia, brought his forces to meet the threat and was driven from the field. It was a comprehensive humiliation for the Mercians, and it left the Thames Valley and the territories south of the river exposed. Then the army crossed the Thames, moving south into Surrey, and there they met something different. Æthelwulf had been watching. He had been gathering his forces, the third of the West Saxon kingdom, that levy of fighting men who owed military service to their king and who could be called to the field when the summons went out across the shires and estates of Wessex. The summons was a serious thing in this world. It was a legal obligation that bound men to their king in times of crisis, a duty that crossed the boundaries between the great ealdormen and the humbler thegns and the freemen who owed service on the land. When the king called, the men of Wessex came, and in 851, with a Danish army of extraordinary size loose in Surrey, after having broken Canterbury and London and the Mercian king's army, the call went out. Æthelwulf came to meet them, and he brought his son. Æthelbald, newly elevated to the rank of ealdorman, rode to war alongside his father. Whatever had been observed of him in the quieter arenas of court and charter, the diligent witnessing of legal documents, the management of regional responsibilities, this was where a prince truly proved himself. This was the arena that mattered most, the one that every man in the court and every subject in the kingdom would be watching. A prince who performed well in battle became something more than a prince by birth. He became a prince by deed, a man who had earned his place in the succession, not merely by the accident of who his father was, but by his willingness to stand in the front rank when it was necessary. The two armies met at a place called Aclea. The name meant oak field in the Old English of the time, and it designated some stretch of ground in Surrey, whose precise location has been debated by historians for generations without a definitive resolution. Aclea, a village in Surrey, has been proposed as the most plausible candidate. It sits in the right general area, and the place name has preserved enough of the original sound to make the identification attractive. But the exact field, the exact slope of ground where the West Saxons and the Danes faced each other in 851, has been swallowed by time and the changing face of the landscape, and we cannot stand there now and say with certainty, here. What we can say is what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records of what happened when the two forces met. The words have survived across 12 centuries, and they carry in them the astonishment of a chronicler who was recording something he had been told was unprecedented, something that exceeded the frame of comparison he had available. Æthelwulf and his son Æthelbald, with the West Saxon army, fought against them at Aclea, and there made the greatest slaughter of a heathen raiding army that we have never heard tell of up to the present day. The greatest slaughter. The chronicler had no precedent for it. The Viking army, this force that had broken Canterbury and London and driven the King of Mercia from the field, was broken in its turn. The West Saxons had fought before, had won and lost against the Norse, but this was something categorically different. The scale of the victory was beyond anything in living memory. The Danish losses were described in terms that suggest not merely a battlefield defeat, but something closer to a catastrophe. An army that had arrived expecting another Canterbury, another London, finding instead the full organized military force of a kingdom that was ready and willing to fight. We do not have the tactical details of the battle. The sources tell us the outcome but not the choreography. We do not know whether the West Saxons chose their ground carefully, positioning their shield wall on a slope or behind some natural feature that gave them advantage. We do not know whether the fighting was brief and decisive or long and grinding. We do not know what Æthelbald specifically did in the battle, whether he led a section of the line, whether he was in the thick of the fighting from the beginning, whether it was his ealdorman's division that broke some critical part of the Danish formation. The chronicle names him alongside his father as the leaders of the army, and that is all. But that naming matters. In the accounting of the chronicle, Æthelwulf and Æthelbald together defeated the Danes at Aclea. The son's name is joined to his father's in the record of the greatest military achievement of the generation. Whatever his role in the specific mechanics of the battle, he was there, he fought, and the victory was credited to both of them. The aftermath of Aclea had practical consequences that went beyond the symbolic. The Viking raids on Wessex did diminish in the years immediately following the battle, not because the Norse suddenly lost interest in England, but because the losses they had suffered were significant enough to redirect their attentions to softer targets for a time. The fleet that had thought to harvest the wealth of the Thames Valley and Surrey had instead been cut to pieces. The news of that cutting travelled back across the North Sea, and for a season, the pressure on Wessex eased. It was not peace, it never was peace, in the Viking Age, but it was a breathing space, and in the grinding world of 9th century defence, breathing spaces were worth fighting for. For Æthelbald personally, the battle marked a transition. He had been, before Aclea, a prince of rank and promise, a young man whose name appeared in charters and whose elevation to the ealdormanship suggested his father's confidence in him. After Aclea, he was something more, a proven warrior, a man who had stood in the line against 350 ships' worth of enemies and had not flinched. The reputation that a man carried out of such a battle followed him for the rest of his life. It made him credible in a way that no amount of charter witnessing or administrative competence could replicate. In a world that understood, at the most fundamental level, that the person holding the throne needed to be capable of leading men in war, Æthelbald had demonstrated that he was capable. He had earned his spurs, in the most literal sense the age offered. The years after Aclea were years of continued growth. In 854, the sources record both Æthelbald and his younger brother Ecgberht witnessing their father's charters as ducks, as men of ealdorman rank. The two brothers appear together in the legal record, both recognized, both working within the formal structures of the kingdom's governance. The picture that emerges is of a functioning royal family, brothers taking on the work of administration alongside their father, preparing, perhaps without quite knowing how close that preparation was to being tested, for the time when they would need to manage things on their own. That time came sooner than anyone expected. King Æthelwulf was a pious man. This was not merely a reputation or a performance. The sources, across their considerable differences and biases, agree on this point with unusual consistency. He gave generously to the church from the revenues of his kingdom. He prayed. He thought about his soul and the souls of his people with a seriousness that his contemporaries found genuine and not merely ceremonial, and like other deeply pious kings before him, including King Æthelbald of Wessex, who had abdicated his throne in 726 to end his days in Rome, and King Æthelwulf, who had made the same journey a generation before that, Æthelwulf felt, as he moved through the later years of his reign, a calling that was difficult to set aside. He wanted to go to Rome. A pilgrimage to Rome was not, in the 9th century, a casual undertaking. It was a journey of months, crossing territories that were themselves far from safe, passing through the Frankish kingdoms with their own internal conflicts, traversing the Alps, a crossing that could be treacherous in any season and potentially fatal in the wrong one, and then making the long descent through northern Italy to the city on the Tiber. The roads were rough, the inns uncertain, the bandits real. A party of pilgrims, even a royal party, was dependent on the goodwill of the rulers through whose lands they passed, on the hospitality of monasteries along the route, on a combination of careful planning and good fortune. For a king to make this journey meant, above everything else, leaving his kingdom. For a year or more, the man who should be sitting in the great hall receiving petitions and judging disputes and leading the Fyrd would be gone. Somewhere south of the Alps, unreachable in any practical sense, trusting in the arrangements he had made before he left, and in the men he had left to manage things in his absence. In 855, Æthelwulf made his preparations. He would take with him his youngest son, Alfred, a child of around 6, who is described in later sources as having already shown the kind of attentiveness and curiosity that would, in time, make him one of the most remarkable rulers England ever produced. Whether Æthelwulf brought Alfred out of special love for the boy, or because he wanted the child to have the spiritual benefit of a Roman pilgrimage at an impressionable age, or for some combination of the two, we cannot say for certain. What we know is that the little boy made the journey south, while his older brothers stayed behind. The arrangements for the kingdom's management during the pilgrimage were formal and deliberate. Æthelbald, as the eldest surviving son, and the man who had proved himself at Aclea, was appointed to govern Wessex in his father's absence. It was not exactly a regency in the later, more legally precise sense of that word. The political vocabulary and constitutional machinery of 9th century England did not have quite the same clarity of definition that later ages would develop. But in practical terms, Æthelbald held the authority of the West Saxon kingship while his father was away. Ecgberht, the next brother, was given authority over Kent and the southeastern territories. The arrangement was clean and sensible. The two main territorial components of the House of Wessex were each entrusted to a son, and the kingdom was expected to manage itself through those two sons until Æthelwulf returned. What no one seems to have fully reckoned with, or perhaps those who did reckon with it chose not to speak too loudly, was what Æthelwulf might do on the road. He spent a year in Rome itself. He visited the great basilicas, St. Peter's, where the bones of the apostle were venerated, and St. Paul's, and the many other churches and shrines that made Rome the spiritual heart of the Western Christian world. He gave gifts on a considerable scale. Gifts to the churches, gifts to the poor, gifts to the papal court, the kind of generous munificence that a wealthy and pious king was expected to demonstrate when visiting the seat of Christian authority. He was received with honour appropriate to his station, a king of the West Saxons, a man who had defended Christian England against the heathen Norse, a royal pilgrim in the most ancient tradition. And when his time in Rome was done and the long road home began, he took a route that led him north through the Frankish territories and into the court of Charles the Bald. Charles the Bald was the king of West Francia, the western portion of what had once been the unified empire of his grandfather Charlemagne. He was, in 856, a ruler under considerable pressure. The Viking raids that were afflicting England were afflicting his kingdom too. Norse fleets had been pressing into the rivers of Francia for decades, travelling up the Seine and the Loire with a boldness that spoke of experience and confidence. He was also managing, as Carolingian rulers perpetually had to manage, the centrifugal forces of a nobility that was always looking for opportunities to expand its own power at the crown's expense. He needed allies. He needed men of reputation and military experience who could lend their prestige to his own and perhaps their practical support in resisting the Norse. Here, at his court, was Æthelwulf of Wessex, a man who had beaten the Danes at Aclea in a victory that the chroniclers called unprecedented, a man of deep piety and evident seriousness, whose long pilgrimage spoke of real devotion rather than political theatre, a man, furthermore, who was old enough to have put the military adventures of his youth somewhat behind him, a king in his mid to late 50s, recently returned from Rome with no queen at his side, his first wife Osburh apparently having died before his departure, or perhaps having been set aside. The conversation between the two men, conducted through interpreters and counsellors in the formal setting of a Carolingian royal court, produced a marriage agreement. Judith was Charles's daughter, his eldest daughter, his firstborn, born around 844, which made her approximately 12 years old in the autumn of 856. She was a great-granddaughter of Charlemagne, descended through her father from the man who had unified much of Western Europe under his rule, and whose memory continued to invest the Carolingian dynasty with an almost sacred weight. She had been raised in the sophisticated world of the Carolingian court, educated, accomplished, accustomed to the ceremonies and protocols of royal life in a way that was quite different from the rougher, less formally elaborate world of the West Saxon court. Whether Judith had any opinion about the proposed marriage, whether anyone thought to ask her, whether the 12-year-old girl was consulted or simply informed, the sources do not record. The decision was her father's to make, and it was made for the usual reasons of the age: alliance, prestige, mutual benefit. For Charles, the marriage gave him a formal connection to the king who had beaten the Norse at Aclea. For Æthelwulf, it gave him an association with Carolingian prestige that could only strengthen his dynastic standing. On the first day of October, 856, at Ecgberht in northern France, the marriage was solemnized. The ceremony was conducted with all the formal weight that the occasion demanded. The Bishop of Reims, Hincmar, one of the most prominent churchmen of the Carolingian world, a man of extraordinary learning and political influence, officiated. And then, at Charles's insistence, something happened that was not standard in Wessex. Judith was anointed. The bishop placed holy oil on her forehead in the same manner as a king was consecrated at his coronation. She was given a crown. Æthelwulf conferred upon her the formal title of Queen, a title that, as we have noted, West Saxon custom did not normally bestow upon the wives of kings. The ceremony at Ecgberht made Judith not merely the king's wife, but a crowned and anointed queen, a status that carried specific religious and political weight. It was, as the historian D.P. Kirby observed, a ceremony with implications that went far beyond the marriage itself. The anointing of a queen was understood in the 9th century Carolingian tradition, as a blessing on her fertility, a sacred act that invested her potential children with an additional quality of legitimacy and prestige. When Kirby wrote that Judith's anointing was a charismatic sanctification which enhanced her status, blessed her womb, and conferred additional throne-worthiness on her male offspring, he was describing something that contemporaries would have understood immediately. A son of Judith's would be born not merely as the son of a king, but as the son of a crowned queen, the son of an anointed woman, the descendant of Charlemagne. He would carry something in his very birth that Æthelbald and Ecgberht and the other older sons did not carry. This news, the marriage, the anointing, the title of queen, travelled ahead of the returning royal party. In the autumn of 856, somewhere in Wessex or in Kent, Æthelbald learned what his father had done, and everything changed. Here the story becomes genuinely complicated, because we are entering territory where the available sources are thin, biased, and partially contradictory. What happened when Æthelwulf returned to England with his young Carolingian queen is one of the most debated episodes of the early Anglo-Saxon period. Not because historians disagree about the basic facts, which are few enough to state quickly, but because the interpretation of those facts and the question of who did what and why resists simple answers. The main account of the crisis comes from Asa, the Welsh monk who became Bishop of Sherborne and who wrote his biography of Alfred the Great in 893. Asa was not a disinterested observer. He admired Alfred with an intensity that bordered on devotion, and his biography is shaped throughout by the desire to present Alfred as the culmination of his dynasty, the figure toward whom everything that came before was, in some sense, pointing. This means that Asa's treatment of Alfred's older brothers is complicated by the need to acknowledge them without diminishing Alfred, and his treatment of Æthelbald in particular is coloured by a genuine moral disapproval of the choices Æthelbald made. With those cautions clearly noted, here is what Asa says. During Æthelwulf's absence on pilgrimage, a conspiracy was hatched. It was organised, Asa tells us, in the western part of Selwood, a geographical specification that carries political weight, as we will discuss. Its primary architects were two of the most powerful men in western Wessex, Aelstan, the Bishop of Sherborne, who had held that office for over 30 years, and who was, by any account, one of the most politically influential figures in the kingdom, and Æthelwulf, the Ealdorman of Somerset, a major landowner and regional magnate who had served as one of Æthelwulf's most senior advisors. The goal of the conspiracy, Asa says, was nothing less than to prevent the king from reclaiming his throne when he returned from Rome. Many men, Asa writes, blamed Æthelbald himself for the whole affair, said it was his arrogance, his grasping ambition. Asa is careful to record this as the view of many people rather than stating it as his own certain knowledge, but his sympathy is unmistakably with the father, not the son. He calls what happened a terrible crime, expelling the king from his own kingdom. He thanks God that it did not fully succeed, and notes that the nobility of the whole Saxon land refused to have any part in it. The framing is of a failed act of treason, providentially averted. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the other great primary source for this period, says nothing about any of this, not a word. The conspiracy, the confrontation, the division of the kingdom, none of it is mentioned. The Chronicle was compiled later in the century under the patronage of Alfred the Great, and its silence on events that might have reflected poorly on Alfred's older brother is almost certainly deliberate. Chronicles are selective documents. What they choose not to record is sometimes as significant as what they do record. This leaves us in the position of having one rich account and one eloquent silence, and needing to navigate between them. Most modern historians accept that something significant happened when Æthelwulf returned. The subsequent division of the kingdom is difficult to explain otherwise. But they are cautious about accepting Asa's framing wholesale. The geography of the conspiracy is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illuminates the deeper politics at work. Selwood Forest was an ancient boundary running roughly north-south through what is now the border country between Wiltshire, Somerset, and Dorset. It was not merely a physical boundary, it was a cultural and ecclesiastical one. To the west of Selwood lay the diocese of Sherborne, whose vast territory stretched across Dorset, Somerset, Devon, and Cornwall. The old heartland of the West Saxon kingdom, the territories where the roots of the dynasty ran deepest, and where the Sherborne bishops had exercised enormous influence for generations. To the east lay the diocese of Winchester, whose city was the administrative and ecclesiastical centre of eastern Wessex. During Æthelwulf's reign, the balance between these two ecclesiastical powers had been shifting. The king had appointed Swithin as Bishop of Winchester in 852, and Swithin enjoyed a particularly close relationship with the king. The kind of personal trust and royal favour that translated into influence and resources and prestige. The Winchester diocese was growing in significance, and the great men of the Western Sherborne diocese, Aelstan above all, may well have resented the shift. The sense that the patronage and attention of their king was flowing increasingly eastward. When Æthelwulf went to Rome and left Æthelbald as regent in Wessex, the Western magnates found themselves, perhaps for the first time in years, in a position where the king's eastern preferences were irrelevant, where the man with the effective authority was a young prince whose political associations were with the West, whose personal patronage would follow the Sherborne diocese rather than Winchester. The prospect of Æthelwulf returning with a crowned Carolingian queen, a queen whose sons would be marked from birth as the preferred heirs, a queen whose very presence would reinforce the royal connection with the eastern ecclesiastical establishment, was a threat that Aelstan and Æthelwulf could understand in very concrete terms. Richard Abels, one of the most careful modern historians of this period, has noted the specific anxiety that would have attended Æthelwulf's absence. All knew the dangers that attended a pilgrimage to Rome and were aware of the possibility that Æthelwulf would not return. His departure to Rome all but invited the prowling of hungry Æthelings. In other words, the pilgrimage itself created a political vacuum that ambitious men, including potentially Æthelbald, would naturally move to fill, whether the filling was a deliberate conspiracy or simply the natural tendency of power to consolidate around whoever was actually present and governing, is something that the sources cannot definitively resolve. What Asa describes as the outcome is a confrontation avoided. Æthelwulf returned to find his son in possession of the throne of Wessex, backed by the most powerful political figures in the western part of the kingdom. He had his own supporters, the eastern magnates, the Winchester establishment, and, crucially, the broad weight of sentiment among the West Saxon nobility, whom Asa says refused to support Æthelbald's attempt to hold the throne against his father. But a civil war, father against son, east against west, Winchester against Sherborne, would have been catastrophic. It would have shattered the unity that the House of Wessex had worked to build, given the Vikings another opening at the worst possible moment, and ultimately served nobody except Wessex's enemies. Æthelwulf, perhaps to his credit, chose accommodation over war. The kingdom was divided. Æthelbald would continue to rule Wessex, or the western portion of it, depending on which interpretation of the settlement you find most persuasive. Æthelwulf would take Kent and the eastern territories. The precise mechanics are disputed by modern scholars. Simon Keynes believes Æthelwulf retained a degree of sovereignty over the whole. Anne Williams dates the beginning of Æthelbald's reign to 855, treating father and son as joint kings from the return until Æthelwulf's death. Others argue that Wessex itself was physically divided along the Selwood line, with the west going to Æthelbald and the east to his father. No single scholarly interpretation commands universal assent. What all sources agree on is that Æthelbald came out of the episode in possession of a crown, the crown he had refused to yield, and that Æthelwulf had yielded rather than fight. Æthelwulf lived for 2 more years after his return. He spent those years in whatever portion of his kingdom he had retained, with Judith at his side. She is recorded as having witnessed at least one charter from this period, her name in the list a reminder of the extraordinary position her coronation had given her. Whether she and the aging, pious king found any genuine warmth in their marriage, whether the old man was kind to the girl who had been brought from her father's court to this strange, damp island kingdom, we cannot know. What we know is that the marriage produced no children. The hypothetical Carolingian heir who had been the source of so much anxiety never materialized. Judith's womb, so ceremonially blessed at Ecgberht, yielded nothing. On the 13th of January, 858, Æthelwulf died. The death of Æthelwulf resolved one crisis and opened a new chapter. Æthelbald stepped cleanly into the role he had been preparing for and holding in anticipation for years. He was now, without qualification or contest, King of Wessex. The succession passed without the violent disruption that 856 had threatened. Ecgberht continued in Kent. The 2 brothers, as the surviving charter evidence suggests, maintained a cooperative relationship. But Æthelbald was not done making decisions that would astonish his world. Judith, the young widow of his father, was still in England. She was in her mid-teens, perhaps 14, perhaps 15, and she was technically in the early stages of arranging her return to her father's court in West Francia. She had come to England as a diplomatic asset, and even as a widow she remained one. She was still a Carolingian princess, still the eldest daughter of the king of the West Franks, still the great-granddaughter of Charlemagne, and she was still, crucially, uniquely, a crowned and anointed queen, a status she would carry for the rest of her life regardless of the specific circumstances of her present situation. Within a short time of his father's death, Æthelbald married her. The marriage was not, by any reasonable assessment, a conventional one. It was, by the standards of canon law as the medieval church understood them, a prohibited union. A stepson marrying his father's widow fell within the prohibited degrees of affinity. The network of relationships that the church treated as too close for marriage, on the grounds that marriage created a kind of kinship that was almost equivalent to blood relationship. For Æthelbald to marry Judith was, in the church's view, something uncomfortably close to marrying his own mother. Asser, writing in the 890s, reached for the most comprehensive condemnation in his repertoire. The marriage was, he wrote, against God's prohibition and Christian dignity, and also contrary to the practice of all pagans. It was not merely sinful in the ordinary way, it was worse than what heathens did, a transgression so fundamental that even those who did not acknowledge the Christian God would have recognized it as a violation of natural order, Later, medieval writers echoed and amplified the condemnation. William of Malmesbury called Æthelbald worthless and disloyal, and said he had defiled his father's marriage bed. John of Worcester used language of brazen, deliberate defiance of divine law. But consider, for a moment, the other side of this evidence. The Frankish sources, the Annals of Saint-Bertin, the most carefully maintained contemporary record of Frankish affairs, reported the marriage without moral comment. They noted it as a fact. When they later recorded Judith's return to France after Æthelbald's death, they described her as being received with all the honour due to a queen. There was no suggestion from the Frankish side that she had been dishonoured, that the marriage had been scandalous, that her second English husband had done anything requiring particular condemnation. The Franks recorded it and moved on. This divergence between English ecclesiastical horror and Frankish pragmatic acceptance is important. It tells us that the marriage, whatever its canonical status, was not universally seen in the same light. The Franks, who were themselves sophisticated political operators with a long tradition of complex dynastic marriages, appear to have seen Æthelbald's decision as a rational, if unusual, political move. The English Church, operating from Asser's standpoint 35 years after the fact, chose to see it as a moral catastrophe. What was the political logic? It was, once you strip away the moral language, fairly clear. Judith was a crowned queen, uniquely so in the West Saxon tradition. No other woman in Æthelbald's kingdom held that title. Her status gave her a ceremonial weight, a legitimacy, a connection to the prestige of the Carolingian dynasty. That was a genuine asset. If she left England, that asset left with her. If she stayed, as queen beside a king, her status became his. A son born to Judith and Æthelbald would carry something that no child of any other woman Æthelbald might have married could carry: Carolingian blood, Carolingian prestige, the specific dynastic glamour of descent from Charlemagne. The historian Pauline Stafford has argued that Judith's appearances as a witness to the royal charters of Æthelbald's reign, those two surviving documents in which her name appears, are evidence of deliberate political signalling. 9th century West Saxon queens did not normally witness royal charters. The fact that Judith did, in both documents that survived from the reign, suggests that Æthelbald was consciously maintaining and displaying her queenly status as a political statement. She was not merely his wife, she was his crowned queen, and any son she bore would be heir to something more than ordinary West Saxon blood. As for Judith herself, the young woman at the centre of all this political calculation, what can we say? She had been brought to England at the age of 12, married to an old man, widowed before she was 15, and now married again to a man who was perhaps 15 or 20 years her senior, in a union that the Church considered prohibited. She had no apparent say in any of these arrangements. She was, by every formal measure, an object of political exchange, moved from one set of male hands to another as the calculations of kings and dynasties required. And yet, the story of what happened to Judith after Æthelbald's death, a story we will come to in time, suggests that she was something more than a passive instrument. She was a woman who, when she finally had the opportunity to act on her own behalf, acted with startling boldness and independence. The Carolingian princess, who had been married twice before she turned 17, who had been widowed twice, who had been managed and arranged and exchanged by the men around her. She had something in her, some core of will and self-direction, that would eventually, spectacularly, express itself. But that is for later. What we know of the marriage's practical context is limited to the charter evidence and the silence of the non-English sources. Whether there was warmth between Æthelbald and the young woman he had married, whether the queen who witnessed his legal documents was present at court in a meaningful way, or was kept at a comfortable distance, while her name was used for political purposes, whether she was happy or miserable, or somewhere in the wide territory between those extremes, the historical record does not say. What we know of Æthelbald's governance of Wessex is, by any honest accounting, very little. The documentary record is sparse to the point of near silence, and the silence itself tells us something, though historians disagree about exactly what. Only 2 of his charters survive in forms that scholars consider reasonably credible, and even those are attended by scholarly debate. The first, known in the catalogues as S1274, is dated 858, the year of his father's death and his own assumption of full kingship. It records a grant by the Bishop of Winchester, Swithin, his father's favoured churchman, of an episcopal estate at Farnham to the king for his lifetime. The historian Barbara York has read this charter as potentially revealing. She sees it as evidence of a pattern. Æthelbald taking church lands for his own use, specifically targeting the Winchester diocese that had been so close to his father. If her reading is correct, then behind the sparse documentary record, there was a real and ongoing tension between Æthelbald and the Winchester establishment. A king extracting resources from the ecclesiastical power base that had supported his father against him, redirecting wealth and influence from east to west in a systematic way. The second charter, S. 326, is dated to 860, the final year of the reign. It records a straightforward grant, 14 hides of land at Teffent in Wiltshire to a man named Osmond. Osmond was a thegn, a man of middling noble rank, someone whose name appears and then disappears again from the record without generating any further historical attention. The grant itself is entirely typical of the kind of royal land distribution that kept the loyalty of the nobility flowing toward the crown. Kings gave land, recipients gave loyalty, military service, and the kind of practical cooperation that made a kingdom function. It was the fundamental transaction of early medieval governance. Both charters are attested by Judith, her presence in the witness list of both surviving documents. The only documents from the reign is, as we have noted, historically significant in itself. 9th century West Saxon queens did not normally witness charters. The right to appear in the formal legal record as a witness, to have one's name stand as testimony to the king's legal acts, was a mark of genuine authority, not merely ceremonial presence. That Judith appears in both surviving documents speaks to the deliberate maintenance of her queenly status throughout the reign. And then there is the silence of the coins. The main mints of southern England during this period were located in Kent, at Canterbury, and at Rochester, and these mints operated throughout the mid-9th century with reasonable regularity, producing coins in the names of the kings who held authority over them. They minted coins in Æthelwulf's name until 858. After Æthelwulf's death, they minted in Ethelbert's name, the king who held Kent. There is no gap, no transition period in which coins bearing Æthelbald's name appear. The Kentish mints simply moved from Æthelwulf to Ecgberht, as if Æthelbald had never been king of anything connected to those mints. This is evidence, the numismatic historians suggest, that Æthelbald was not the overlord of Ethelbert in Kent, that the two brothers held genuinely separate, co-equal territories, neither subordinate to the other, rather than one being a sub-king under the other's authority. There was also a mint somewhere in Wessex itself, probably at Southampton or Winchester, but it operated at an extremely low level during this period. 3 coins between Æthelwulf and Æthelred I, unknown from this mint, all produced by the same moneyer, and none of them bears Æthelbald's name. The 3 coins from the 19th century that were thought for a time to be Æthelbald's were examined in the early 20th century and found to be forgeries. Not a single genuine coin of Æthelbald's has ever been authenticated. For a king who ruled for anywhere between 2 and 5 years, this is a striking absence, one that adds to the ghostly, under-documented quality of the reign. What does this sparse record actually tell us? The temptation is to read the absence of documentation as evidence of a poor reign, a king who accomplished nothing worth recording, who governed badly, who left nothing behind because there was nothing to leave. But that reading is probably too hasty. Early medieval documentary survival is genuinely uneven. Monasteries burned, archives were destroyed. The specific circumstances that led to the preservation of any particular charter were dependent on the administrative habits of specific religious houses, the survival of those houses through subsequent centuries, and a large measure of chance. Many charters that must have been issued, routine grants of land, confirmations of privileges, transfers of estate, have simply not survived. What the absence of coins is slightly harder to explain away. Coinage was the most widely distributed physical representation of royal authority in this period, and a king who issued no coins either had no access to the major mints or deliberately chose not to issue in his own name. The former seems more likely, given what we know about the separate territorial arrangements between Æthelbald and Ecgberht in Kent. But it does suggest a king whose authority was, in some material sense, more limited than a straightforward account of the succession might imply. The absence of recorded military activity is also notable, though again not necessarily proof of passivity. The Viking raids were ongoing throughout this period. The chronicles record Norse activity in England and Francia across the late 850s and early 860s. If Æthelbald was engaged in defending Wessex against raiders, it is possible that those defences were conducted and managed without generating the kind of chronicle entry that would preserve them. Small-scale defensive operations, successful enough to prevent major disaster, but not dramatic enough to attract a chronicler's special attention, would leave precisely this kind of silence. One detail that the scholarship does preserve, and that is worth dwelling on, is the suggestion made by the historian Janet Nelson that Judith's presence at Æthelbald's court may have had a real administrative significance. The earliest West Saxon charter to include a requirement for contribution to fortification work dates from this reign, a requirement that landholders contribute to the construction or maintenance of defensive structures. Nelson has observed that Charles the Bald, Judith's father, undertook a significant program of fortress building and town wall construction in West Francia in the years immediately following Judith's time in England. The timing is suggestive. Judith came from a court where defensive architecture was being systematically developed as a response to Viking pressure. She came with a Carolingian entourage, advisors, courtiers, household officers trained in the administrative practices of the most sophisticated court in Western Europe. If any of those advisors brought with them the ideas and practices of Carolingian defensive administration, the fortification requirement in Æthelbald's charter might be a trace of their influence, a small but real import of Frankish administrative practice into the West Saxon world. It is a detail that would be easy to overlook, but it matters because it pushes back against the image of Judith as purely passive and purely decorative. If the Carolingian queen brought Carolingian administrative innovations to Wessex, even indirectly, through her entourage, through the practices they normalized in a court where she was the reference point for how things were done in the sophisticated South, then her presence was not merely symbolic, it was functional. It contributed something. What Æthelbald himself felt about his reign, his marriage, his position in the dynasty, whether he was satisfied with what he had built or haunted by what he had not, is beyond the reach of any source. No private correspondence, no personal statement, nothing that speaks directly from the man to us. We have his name on charters. We have his wife's name beside his. We have the absence of coins and the sparse record of a short and poorly documented reign. And then, in the summer of 860, we have his death. The cause of Æthelbald's death is not recorded anywhere. He was, in all probability, in his early to mid-30s, young by any standard, for a man who had fought at Aclea and governed a kingdom. The diseases of the early medieval world were various, unpredictable, and lethal in ways that the modern age has largely forgotten. Fever, infection, the slow erosion of a body worn down by years of physical hardship and poor nutrition, and the accumulated stress of leadership in a time of perpetual crisis. Whether illness took him, or some injury, whose origin the sources chose not to record, or simply one of the swift and indiscriminate deaths that the 9th century dispensed without warning, we cannot say. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives him a reign of 5 years, counting from 855, when his father first departed for Rome. Asser, working from a different starting point, gives him 2.5 years of sole rule after Æthelwulf's death in January 858, plus 2.5 years of shared or joint governance before that. By Asser's arithmetic, given that Æthelwulf died in January 858, and that Æthelbald ruled for 2.5 years after, the king died somewhere around July 860. He left no children. Neither of his marriages, if the possible earlier marriage hinted at in some sources existed, had produced an heir. Judith, his young queen, had not conceived. Whatever plans Æthelbald may have had for the succession, for the continuation of his line, for the future of the Carolingian connection he had worked to maintain through his controversial marriage, all of those plans died with him, unexecuted, in the summer of a year that had begun with him king, and ended with his body being carried west to Sherborne. He was buried at Sherborne. This is confirmed by both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and by Asser, and the tradition of the burial site has been maintained continuously at the abbey. Sherborne, in what is now the county of Dorset, was the seat of the Great Western Diocese, the Diocese of Bishop Aelstane, whose political alliance with Æthelbald had been so significant in the events of 856. It was a choice of burial place that reflected, even in death, the Western orientation of Æthelbald's political world. The Abbey Church at Sherborne had been one of the principal ecclesiastical buildings of the West Saxon Kingdom since its foundation under King Æthelwulf in 705, when the Diocese of Sherborne was established to relieve the growing pressure on the Diocese of Winchester. To be buried there was to be numbered among the significant men of the Western realm. The abbey that Æthelbald was carried to in 860 was a different building from the one that stands in Sherborne today. What exists now is largely the product of the Norman and later medieval periods. Rebuilt and expanded across the centuries, its great fan-vaulted ceiling, one of the earliest and finest in England, installed in the 15th century, its Norman transepts and Gothic choir replacing the simpler Saxon structures that Æthelbald's contemporaries would have known. But the ground is the same ground, and the tradition of continuity is genuine. Christian worship has been conducted in Sherborne without interruption since Inne founded the see in 705. In the north choir aisle of the present abbey, there are tombs. Tradition associates them with Æthelbald and his brother Ecgberht, who died 5 years later and was buried alongside him, as Asa records, interred in honourable wise at Sherborne by the side of his brother. The tradition is very old and widely credited. Whether the specific remains within the stone tombs are genuinely those of the two 9th century kings is a question that came under scrutiny in the 20th century, when a medieval sarcophagus discovered in 1925 generated various claims that were subsequently evaluated and complicated by the observation that the sarcophagus itself appeared to date from the 13th century rather than the 9th. The question of the specific physical remains has not been definitively resolved, but the tradition of the burial is not in serious doubt. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says Æthelbald was buried at Sherborne. Asa says his brother was buried beside him. The abbey has maintained the association across 13 centuries, and in the north choir aisle of the present building, beneath the accumulated weight of Norman stone and Gothic vaulting and centuries of prayer, there is the memory of two young kings who held Wessex in the uncertain decades before their youngest brother came into his fame. Henry of Huntingdon, writing in the 12th century, captured something of what the loss of Æthelbald may have felt like to contemporaries. All England lamented King Æthelbald's youth, and there was great sorrow over him. We cannot verify this. Henry was writing 3 centuries after the fact, drawing on traditions that may or may not have accurately preserved the emotional register of 860. But it is worth considering the possibility that it was true, that the young king who had fought at Aclea and navigated the terrible politics of the succession, who had governed Wessex for the years between Æthelwulf and Ecgberht, with whatever competence the thin record suggests, was genuinely mourned, that people recognized in his early death the loss of a man who might have done more, who had shown qualities, courage, ambition, political shrewdness, that the age valued and needed. He was not Alfred. He was not the figure around whom the chronicles organized their sense of the century's meaning. But he was a king, and he was mourned, and he was buried in the old Western church, with whatever honor his position demanded. And then the throne passed to his brother, and the world continued. The death of Æthelbald in the summer of 860 left Judith a widow for the second time before she was 17 years old. She had come to England as a child bride in 856, had been married to an old king, and then widowed, had then been married to that king's son in a union that the church found scandalous, and was now free, or as free as a Carolingian princess could be, which was not very free at all. She made arrangements to leave. She sold or transferred her English properties, the estates and assets that had presumably accumulated to her as queen, and prepared for the journey back to Francia. Her father Charles the Bald, learning that his daughter was returning, made his own arrangements. Judith arrived home to find herself placed under episcopal guardianship in the monastery of Senlis, a house of religious women in the Île-de-France, somewhere not far from Paris. Charles, presumably, was planning his next move. Another marriage, another alliance, another diplomatic deployment of his eldest daughter's now considerable dynastic currency. She had been Queen of Wessex twice. She was still young enough to marry again. She still carried the Carolingian name and the anointed queen status. These were valuable assets, and Charles intended to manage them carefully. The guardianship at Senlis was not imprisonment in any dramatic sense. Judith was not locked in a dungeon or kept in physical confinement, but it was supervision. She was under the authority of the bishop, living within the walls of the monastery, her movements and her contacts monitored in the way that a valuable asset is monitored by someone who knows its value and is worried about its going astray. The worry was not misplaced. Around Christmas of 861, Judith escaped. A man named Baldwin had come to Senlis, apparently to negotiate with Judith's brother Louis the Stammerer over some matter of territorial interest. Baldwin was a young nobleman of obscure origins. His background was not recorded in the chronicles, which is itself a sign that he came from no great house whose lineage the royal scribes would have thought worth noting. He was ambitious and apparently bold. His later nickname, Iron Arm, suggests a man who made his reputation with physical force and personal courage, rather than inherited prestige. He had, by some means, come to the attention of the confined young widow queen. Whether what followed was a romantic elopement, a calculated political partnership, an abduction, or some mixture of all three, the chronicles cannot entirely agree. The Flemish tradition, in later centuries, told romantic stories about Baldwin's love for the queen, tales of longing and chivalric devotion that are almost certainly elaborations of a much more practical reality. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Judith left the monastery of Senlis with Baldwin, in what appears to have been a coordinated act that may have had the quiet blessing of her brother Louis, if not of her father. They were probably married before they left the monastery, in a ceremony conducted with whatever speed and minimum of ceremony the situation demanded. And then they ran. Charles the Bald was furious. He had his archbishop, Hincmar, the same Hincmar of Reims, who had officiated at Judith's first marriage at Verberie, pronounce excommunication on the couple. He sought to have them captured and returned. The runaway queen and her obscure Flemish count fled north and west, looking for protection and safe harbour in a Europe where the wrath of a Carolingian king was not a small thing. They found temporary refuge at the court of Lothair II, King of Lotharingia, who was Judith's uncle by marriage. But when Charles threatened Lothair, even that haven became uncertain. They did the most audacious thing available to them. They went to Rome. They appeared before Pope Nicholas I and threw themselves on his mercy, explaining their case and asking for his intervention. It was a bold gamble, because the Pope was not automatically sympathetic to those who defied a Carolingian king. The relationship between the papacy and the Carolingian dynasty was long and complicated, and involved obligations on both sides. But Nicholas I was a man of considerable independence and strong views about the limits of royal power over the Church's sacraments. He heard their case, considered it, and concluded that the marriage should be recognized. He wrote to Charles, urging the king to accept his daughter's union with Baldwin. The arguments he made were arguments about the validity of the marriage, about the rights of consenting parties, about the impropriety of forcing a marriage annulment when no canonical grounds existed for it. Charles, faced with papal pressure from the most senior ecclesiastical authority in the Western world, made the political calculation that continuing to fight was not worth the cost. In late 862, he was reconciled with Judith and Baldwin. The marriage was formally legitimized, and as the price of peace, and as a practical measure that served his own defensive interests, Charles granted Baldwin the March of Flanders. The March of Flanders was a strip of territory on the North Sea coast, in what is now the Dutch-speaking part of modern Belgium. It was not, at the time, a great prize in itself. The land was low, damp, subject to flooding, agriculturally marginal, and perpetually exposed to the Viking raids that came up the coast and into the estuaries. But it was a defensible position, and it was a beginning. Baldwin accepted it, and he and Judith settled into the work of building something from it. Baldwin proved equal to the task. He defended the march against the Norse. He expanded its territory through a combination of military force and diplomatic acuity. He built administrative structures that would outlast his own life and provide the foundation for what his successors would develop into one of the most powerful comital dynasties in medieval Europe. The county of Flanders, which would later produce some of the most sophisticated textile industries in Europe, which would become one of the great cultural and commercial centres of the medieval world, which would be central to the political history of Northern Europe for centuries, had its origins in the grant that Charles the Bald made to his wayward son-in-law in 862, in the aftermath of a romantic elopement from a monastery. And Judith gave Baldwin a son. The boy was born around 865 and named Baldwin after his father. He would become Baldwin II, Count of Flanders, inheriting his father's position when Baldwin I died in 879. He would rule Flanders until his own death in 918, extending and consolidating the territory his father had built. And he would make, in due course, a marriage that brought the story full circle. Baldwin II married Ælfthryth. She was the daughter of Alfred the Great, the youngest brother of Æthelbald, the man in whose shadow all of this story has been told, the king whose greatness ultimately eclipsed the memory of the scandalous older brother who had briefly held his crown. Ælfthryth of Wessex and Baldwin II of Flanders, the granddaughter of Æthelwulf and the grandson of Judith, the family whose complicated story had begun with a pilgrimage and a Carolingian marriage, were, a generation later, family again, connected through a different branch, reunited in a dynastic alliance that nobody in 856 could possibly have anticipated. History does not move in straight lines, it circles back. It produces connections that could not have been predicted, and consequences that outlast the intentions of those who set them in motion. The marriage that Asa called a sin against God and pagans alike had, in its long tail, produced a dynasty. The dynasty had married back into Wessex, and the Carolingian blood that Æthelbald had worked so hard to keep tied to the House of Wessex through his controversial marriage to Judith was eventually bound to that house again, not through Æthelbald's own children, who never existed, but through a path nobody had planned. In the 890s, a Welsh monk who had become Bishop of Sherborne, and who was the devoted biographer of Alfred the Great, sat down to record his assessment of the man who had been Alfred's oldest surviving brother. The monk was Asa, and his verdict on Æthelbald was not kind. Iniquitous and grasping, that was the phrase. His reign was 2.5 lawless years. The rebellion against his father was an act of pure arrogance, and many men attributed it solely to arrogance on the part of King Æthelbald, because he was grasping in this affair and many other wrongdoings. The marriage to Judith was against God, against Christian dignity, and against all pagan custom alike. This verdict, delivered by the only surviving contemporary or near-contemporary writer who discussed Æthelbald at any length, became the settled view for centuries. The medieval chroniclers who came after Asa largely adopted his framing without question. William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century, called him worthless and disloyal to his father, and said he had sunk to the depths of marrying his stepmother. John of Worcester described his reign as conducted without restraint. Roger of Wendover, in the 13th century, added the detail of a later repentance and a setting aside of Judith, though most modern historians doubt this story, that seems designed to provide a tidier moral conclusion to a story that otherwise left the Church looking unable to enforce its own prohibitions. The portrait that accumulated across the medieval centuries was consistently dark. A bad son, a scandalous husband, a weak or lawless king. The moral framework of the medieval chroniclers required that the rebellion against a father be condemned, that the illicit marriage be condemned, that the short and poorly documented reign be read as evidence of a man who was not up to his position. The story of Æthelbald, as transmitted across the centuries, was the story of a failure, or at best, the story of an embarrassment that needed to be acknowledged and then moved past as quickly as possible on the way to Alfred. But the medieval consensus was not unanimous, and the dissenting voice is worth hearing. Henry of Huntingdon, a 12th century chronicler who was not bound by the same programmatic admiration of Alfred that shaped Asser's work, described Æthelbald and Ecgberht as young men of superlative natural quality, who held their kingdoms very prosperously as long as they each lived. When Æthelbald died, Henry wrote, "All England lamented King Æthelbald's youth, and there was great sorrow over him, and they buried him at Sherborne." The tone is elegiac, not condemnatory. A beloved young king taken too soon, mourned by his people. It is a striking contrast. Two writers, both working from tradition rather than contemporary evidence, arriving at opposite conclusions about the same brief reign. Asser, iniquitous and grasping. Henry, superlative natural quality. The same man, the same reign, entirely different moral registers. What does the modern historian make of this divergence? Frank Stenton, in his magisterial study Anglo-Saxon England, does not venture a personal judgment on Æthelbald's character at all. He notes the rebellion, notes the marriage to Judith, observes that the marriage does not appear to have created any contemporary scandal among the churchmen of Judith's own country, and moves on. Stenton's restraint is itself a kind of verdict, an implicit acknowledgement that the Asser picture is too one-sided to be trusted as a rounded account. Sean Miller, in the modern Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, takes a similar position. Very little is known of Æthelbald's reign after his marriage, but what is known suggests he was on good terms with his brother Ecgberht. The emphasis in modern scholarship falls on the limits of what the evidence actually supports, and on the recognition that Asser was Alfred's biographer, working under Alfred's patronage, writing 3 decades after the events in question, with every reason to emphasize the failings of the older brothers and every reason to avoid anything that might complicate the narrative of Alfred's rise. What can we say honestly about Æthelbald of Wessex? He was a prince born into a dynasty that was fighting for its survival. He proved himself in battle at a young age, standing beside his father at Aclea and helping deliver a victory that the contemporaries themselves called unprecedented. He managed the kingdom of Wessex capably enough during his father's year-long absence that when his father returned, it required a political crisis, not a simple handover, to restore the normal order. He reacted to a genuine dynastic threat, the Carolingian marriage, the anointed queen, the hypothetical Charlemagne-descended heir, with the ruthlessness that the political logic of his world demanded. He made a decision that shocked the English Church, but that Frankish observers found unremarkable, and he ruled for somewhere between 2 and 5 years, leaving almost no positive record, but also leaving no record of catastrophic failure, passing his kingdom to his brother without civil war or Viking conquest or institutional collapse. He was not Alfred. He never became Alfred, never had the opportunity to become Alfred. He died too young, in a summer that the sources do not illuminate, in circumstances the chroniclers did not record. And because he was not Alfred, because he died before the great crisis came, and before the great response to that crisis was mounted, history has been uncertain what to do with him. He is too significant to ignore entirely. He was king. He did things that mattered, and too obscure to give the full biographical treatment that the better documented figures of his century receive. The most honest thing we can say is that he was a man of his age. He lived in a world that rewarded boldness, where the gentle and the scrupulous tended to find themselves outmaneuvered by those willing to act decisively. He acted decisively. He paid the price of doing so in the form of condemnation from the church and a blackened reputation in the medieval tradition that followed. But the kingdom he managed, however poorly, the record preserves the details of that management, survived. It passed to his brother intact. It remained capable of producing the resistance to the great heathen army that his successors would need to mount. That is not a small thing. It is, in the long view of English history, a significant thing. The death of Æthelbald in 860 did not end the story of Wessex. It advanced it to its next and most dramatic chapter. The series of events that would, within a generation, bring the entire Anglo-Saxon world to the brink of destruction, and then, in the hands of one extraordinary king, pull it back. Ecgberht, inheriting both Wessex and Kent at Æthelbald's death, ruled for 5 years in relative stability. The Viking raids continued. They were never entirely absent from the landscape of 9th century England, but did not, during his reign, reach the catastrophic scale that was coming. He governed. He maintained the union of Wessex and Kent that his brother's childless death had made possible. He appears, from the thin record of his reign, to have been a competent and unspectacular king, the kind of ruler who does not generate dramatic stories, but who keeps the essential machinery of government turning. He died in 865 and was buried beside Æthelbald at Sherborne. As Asser records, the two brothers together under the old Western Church, side by side as they had been at Aclea, and in the charter record, and in the political world they had inhabited jointly. Then came Æthelred I, the fourth brother, who inherited the now united kingdom of Wessex and Kent in 865. And in the very same year, the world changed. The great heathen army arrived in England. It was not a raid. Previous Norse activity in England had followed a pattern of seasonal raids. A fleet arrives, moves through a vulnerable territory, takes what it can, and withdraws before the local military response can organize fully. Sometimes the raiders wintered, camping on islands or riverbanks to extend their season. But the great heathen army was something categorically different. It was an army of permanent intent, organized on a scale that no previous Norse venture in England had matched, carrying not merely fighters, but the political ambition to conquer and hold. The men who led it, and the names that the sources give us, Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan among them, had come not to plunder but to settle, to displace the existing rulers and establish their own kingdoms on English soil. It moved through England with a terrible efficiency. Northumbria fell first. The army crossed the Humber in 866 and took York, killing the Northumbrian kings who tried to retake it. Northumbria, the great northern kingdom that had been home to the learning of Bede and the tradition of Lindisfarne, was broken. It would never fully recover as an independent Anglo-Saxon political entity. Then the army turned south. It moved into East Anglia, and in 869 it killed Edmund, King of East Anglia, in circumstances that would make him a martyr and a saint, a king who refused to renounce his faith before his Norse captors and who died for his refusal. East Anglia fell. Then came Mercia. The Mercians, facing the army, chose to negotiate rather than fight. They bought a temporary peace, allowing the army to winter in their territory in exchange for agreements that everyone knew were provisional at best. Mercia was buying time, not safety. And then the army turned its full attention to Wessex. In late 870, the great heathen army moved from Mercia into the territory of the West Saxons. It established its base at Reading, at the confluence of the Thames and the Kennet, building a fortified camp from which it could raid in multiple directions. Æthelred I, who had been watching the army's progress through the other kingdoms with the sick understanding of a man who knows that his own turn is coming, brought the West Saxon forces to meet it. He did not fight alone. Beside him, in battle after battle through the terrible spring of 871, stood his youngest brother Alfred, the boy who had travelled to Rome with his father in 855, who had grown up in the shadow of the older brothers who one by one took their turns on the throne, who had spent his early adulthood learning the trade of governance from those brothers and from the court they maintained. Alfred was in his early 20s in 871, already a man of some military experience, but not yet the figure that history would know him as. He and Æthelred fought the Danes in 4 battles in quick succession: Englefield, Reading, Ashdown, Basing, winning some and losing others, the kingdom hanging by a thread throughout. Æthelred died shortly after Easter 871. The circumstances suggest a man worn down by the relentless campaigning and perhaps by wounds. He left young children, but the kingdom could not afford a child king with an army at the gates, and the traditional practice of Wessex, that the crown should go to the best qualified male of the royal house, not necessarily the direct heir of the last king, meant that the succession fell to Alfred. Alfred inherited a kingdom that was, by any sober assessment, losing. The Danes were present in force. They had broken every other Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England, and Wessex was next. What Alfred did with that inheritance, how he bought time, regrouped, built the network of fortified towns called burhs across the kingdom's landscape, reformed the law codes, encouraged learning and literacy, fought the Danes back step by step until he achieved the victory at Edington in 878 that ended the immediate existential threat, is one of the great stories of the medieval world. It is properly a story for another night, but it is a story that could not have been told without the men who came before, without Ecgberht, who broke Mercia and established the dynasty's dominance, without Æthelwulf, who fought the Norse and kept the kingdom together through 20 years of pressure, without Æthelstan, who won the first sea battle in English history, and without Æthelbald, who held what he had inherited, however controversially, and passed it forward. The chain that ran from Ecgberht to Alfred held. It held through battles and rebellions and scandalous marriages and short reigns with thin documentary records. It held through the death of Æthelbert and the desperate campaigns of Æthelred. And when Alfred received it, he was holding something that a succession of imperfect, complicated, sometimes scandalous men had kept in existence across the most dangerous decades that the English people had yet faced. Æthelbald was one link in that chain, not the strongest link, perhaps, not the most celebrated, but a link that did not break. And in the 9th century, not breaking was everything. And so we come at last to the end of Æthelbald's story, a life that was short and richly complicated, and filtered to us primarily through the pen of a man who did not like him, and the silence of records that barely registered his existence. A life that moved from a prince's careful apprenticeship in his father's court, through the blood-soaked field of Aclea, through the anxious vigil of a regent watching his father's absence turn dangerous, to the bold, calculated stroke of a king who refused to yield. A life that included a marriage that made all of Europe stare, and a reign that left almost no trace beyond 2 charters and a grave in the Western Church. He was not Alfred. He never had the chance to become whatever he might have been given time and the pressure of crisis and the full measure of his potential. He died in a summer that the sources do not illuminate, in a kingdom that was not yet ready for what was coming, and he left no children, no coins, almost no documents, and a reputation that was mostly written by someone who wanted to minimize him. The kindest thing history did for him was to bury him in the abbey of his political allies, beside his brother, in a church that has endured for 13 centuries and continues to welcome those who seek it. But the reputation that Asa constructed, and that later writers amplified, is not the whole story. It is not even most of the story. It is the story as Alfred's biographer needed it to be. A cautionary tale, a negative example, a reminder that the greatness of the youngest brother was not inevitable, but was earned against the background of older brothers who had ruled less wisely. The story, as the evidence actually supports it, is more complicated, more ambiguous, and in its own way more interesting. A young man in an impossible position, making decisions that the logic of his world made comprehensible even when they shocked the church, governing a kingdom that needed governing in the most dangerous period its history had yet seen, and dying before he could prove what he was truly capable of. History is full of figures like Æthelbald, men and women who were significant in their own time, who made decisions that mattered, who shaped the world that came after them in ways both direct and indirect, and who have been reduced by the accidents of documentary survival and the particular interests of those who wrote the records to footnotes in someone else's story. In Æthelbald's case, that someone else was Alfred, and Alfred's greatness is genuine, is extraordinary, is deserving of all the attention it has received. But the greatness of a later figure does not erase the substance of those who came before. It simply makes them harder to see. Tonight, we have tried to see Æthelbald, or as clearly as the distance of 12 centuries and the thinness of the sources allow us to see him. He was neither the monster that Asa painted, nor the beloved young king that Henry of Huntingdon mourned. He was a man of his age, pragmatic and ambitious and capable and occasionally ruthless, bold in ways that crossed the lines his society recognized, loyal in the end to a throne that he had worked his whole life to hold, a king whose people, if Henry of Huntingdon is to be believed even a little, wept when he died. A young man carried off before his time, leaving a kingdom that had grown accustomed to him and that now had to begin again. Let that image carry you gently towards sleep. The young king, buried in the west, in the church of the bishop who had helped make him what he was, beside the brother who followed him. The candles of Sherborne burning low in the nave, the monks moving quietly through the dark hours of their offices, the old building warm with the light of 100 small flames. Outside, the night, the dark hills of Dorset, the long roads running east and north toward a kingdom that is bracing already for what is still to come. The distant sea, always the distant sea, always full of ships, Æthelbald of Wessex. Noble and bold, as his name promised, King of Wessex from 855 to 860, the son who seized his father's crown, the king who married his father's wife, the warrior who stood at Aclea and helped break 350 ships' worth of Viking ambition, one link in a chain that held, one name in the long list of the men who kept England alive long enough for Alfred to save it. That is not nothing. That is, in the long view, more than enough. Sleep well. We will be here when you wake. If tonight's journey through the life of King Æthelbald brought you something new, a corner of history you had not visited before, a figure you had not known, a question you want to pursue further, please consider leaving a gentle like or a quiet comment below. Every piece of engagement helps these stories travel further, and it is always a pleasure to read what you have found here. And if you have not yet joined the Sleepy Crown family, we would be very glad to welcome you. Until next time, good night and rest well.